Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. Unfortunately, I can't be with you in that lovely city of Prague, but I hope to talk to you about our need to increasingly negotiate aging, both personally and between generations. Now, this is the demographic landscape that we're all very familiar with. This shows us the European Union in 2010 and 2050, and it shows that we're moving from loosely a triangular shape to a column. Now, this has certain implications, which are a cultural challenge to us as well as a demographic challenge. We're living longer lives. Generations are becoming then about the same size, and we need to adapt culturally. More to the point, we need to know much more about how adult generations get along with each other. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at policy options and pose a series of questions. And these questions are about positive and negative othering, continuity and discontinuity, within and between age thinking, and present and lifetime centeredness. Now, don't worry if you haven't come across some of those phrases before, because I'm going to come back to them once I've talked about where we are now and where we might be heading. So there are some starting points for cultural adaptation. There are economic solutions primarily, and I would argue that on the one hand, we have been offered ageless work, and this has the virtuous circle in economic terms of more workers providing more taxes and claiming fewer pensions. A second approach, a narrative that we're being offered, is that of consumption, third age consumption, that if we consume more taxes are paid, and we pay for this through more pensions. Both of those keep the wheels of capitalism turning. However, I would think that both of them focus on a continuity of aging and an avoidance of the denial of age difference, because there is an alternative narrative to the economic. This is an example that you are probably familiar with of Erik Erikson's life stages. But rather than focus on that as a particular model, I'm just going to point out that life priorities change as we grow older. So when we look at the psychosocial implications of aging, we can see that at different times in the life course, we have different priorities. And somehow we have to take that into account when we look at intergenerational relations. Now, of course, there's a tension here between sameness and distinctiveness. Economists think that they've solved the problem for us. If we work longer, reduce pensions and consume more, we achieve continuity and stay the same or become socially excluded if we don't fit into that model. The psychosocial awareness posits different life course priorities and contributions that people can make. It focuses on change and how we can adapt to new life course priorities. If age groups differ in their psychosocial priorities, how does that connect to the ageless social practices of productivism, consumerism, and work and non-work? Well, this tension has not quite been worked out as the protagonists may have thought. What we have currently been seeing since the 2010s and the global economic crisis, I would argue, is growing public generational rivalries, which combine these two priorities of distinctiveness based on age and economic sameness negatively. The politics of intergenerational rivalry can be seen in both the United Kingdom and the in Australia, both of which I'm relatively familiar with. And they follow a similar pattern. In the UK, the Policy Exchange in 2006 produced a document called Maggie's Children, which argued that the baby boomers would be stealing the futures of the upcoming millennials. This has been turned into various policy propositions. The book on the left is, on your left, is The Generation Less by Jennifer Rayner, who is a member of the Labour Party in Australia. Now, the Grattan Institute has, and the Intergenerational Foundation in London, the Grattan Institute being in Australia, have both recommended generational rebalancing. That means taking resources away from older adults and giving them to younger adult generations. Now, what they're trying to do here, I would argue, is changing the paradigm for how we think about life course vulnerability. Life course vulnerability should be seen, according to this model, in terms of generational competition between younger and older members of society, which is quite a radical change from how we've traditionally thought of social policy, which is to identify points of vulnerability in the life course, such as in childhood, going in and out of work, and in old age, and replace it with this notion that younger people are in some way disadvantaged by services being given to older people. Now, of course, this model avoids discussing massive global increases in wealth inequality of the last 30 years and creates a new view of conflict within society, which is particularly inflected towards generational relations. Whilst there has been this attempt to change the paradigm towards intergenerational rivalry, just like youth, old age has been subject to increasing precarity. We can see this in lengthened statutory pension eligibility ages, the degraded availability and forms of work for older workers, inadequate and unaffordable housing and care, all of which adds up to a lack of predictability for a long life. Now, I've looked at these with Dina Bauman and Michael McGann at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence on underemployment in midlife and beyond, and more recently with Ashley Carr and Iria Harpala looking at social exclusion as one of the consequences of dementia, if you prefer to follow these up. But now I'm going to move on and talk more about those 4 questions that I started with. And there are 2 issues that I think are important for intergenerational connection: generationally intelligent empathy, and then the tools for policy analysis. So in terms of generational intelligence, we pose the question, how far is it possible to put yourself in the shoes of someone of a different age group? So this looks at the personal and interpersonal elements of perceiving people of different ages. And we said that the degree of generational intelligence depends upon the degree to which people have age-specific experiences and priorities, that they recognize other age groups as distinctive, that they also have things in common, and then the value that is put on similarity and difference. And finally, how do we negotiate shared and sustainable solutions? Now, in the introduction that I showed you some of the existing narratives and the attempted paradigm shift, you can see that there has been an emphasis on continuity and a lack of emphasis on what is distinctive about different age groups. Also, the value of difference when it is identified has often been seen, at least in the public sphere, as predominantly negative. Now, it's very difficult to speak at this time without talking about the pandemic. And if we look at generational intelligence, is it possible to say, are we pulling together or are we pulling apart? What are the possibilities that are afforded to us by this devastating historical occurrence? Well, firstly, I'd say that we've had shared experiences of vulnerability, social isolation and mortality between age groups, and increased community and state support using age criteria. But there's been a clear ambivalence as the pandemic progresses, with firstly older people being seen as vulnerable and at risk, focused on their chronological age, to older people being seen as a risk to the socio and economic activities of others. And then one could argue with vaccinations, a remove back to the at-risk narrative. But for us, what I think this shows is that from initial discussions about the pandemic being a boomer remover, we've moved to a situation where anybody at any age can catch this. And whilst the way the pandemic plays out plays differently for older workers, retirees, and aged care recipients, I think there's grounds to say that we may actually be in a position of increasing intergenerational solidarity. But let's analyze policy. Let's look at these 4 questions and an alternative. The questions were, to what degree do we see positive and negative othering in policy documents or initiatives, continuity and discontinuity within and between age thinking, and present and lifetime centeredness. Now, positive and negative othering, what I mean by that is, to what degree does policy see age differences as positive or negative? Negative, we're familiar with, age-based prejudice and antagonism. But to see the positive othering, that recognizing the value that each age brings to the table and the complementary contributions that connect age groups together, I think is something that we haven't focused on enough when we determine policy directions. Negatively, it's possible to see in health economics the use of age-based criteria for exclusion from services. There's a long history of this, including QALYs, looking at life years and functional age. It's more difficult to point to positive forms of othering, but perhaps the development of specialist services for different age groups would be an example that can be explored there. When we look at the second question, that of continuity and discontinuity or change, we have to ask, what degree does policy emphasize sameness or distinctiveness based on age? Continuity, as we have seen when we looked at the narratives of work and consumerism, can often involve avoiding or denying age based on life course change. Whereas discontinuity gives us the opportunity to recognize changes that occur as the life course progresses. So an example here might be that focus on work productivity, but also recognizing diverse age skills, that different age groups are actually better at different things in the workplace, such as the speed with which things get done, but also seeing systems and large picture connections, which are unevenly distributed according to age. When we look at within and between aged thinking, this concerns how far later life is considered a phenomenon within itself. is policy taking each group separately? And how far are interconnections with other life phases or social issues examined? Seeing how a policy for one age impacts on others and how to create transgenerational policy, in other words. Now, looking at a phenomenon within itself, an example might be carer supports that only looks at or assumes that carers are a particular age, rather than looking at care supports to carers of many different ages. Or looking at the way that education, meaningful life course education, is made available to different phases of the life course. If it's grouped in one age particularly, then we can say it's a within age thinking. If it looks at the connections between age groups, we can say it's between age thinking. And finally, the fourth question that I think we should ask of any policy or initiative is it present or lifetime centered? How far do policies then and theories and interventions focus on the here and now in their analysis? And how far do they focus on their effects upon the whole life course and life changes of individuals and social groups? And perhaps an example here could be pensions policy, which is often constructed on a year-on-year fiscal basis. The problem with that is that both younger and older generations feel that this is a form of cheating. For the older generations, you don't get what you were promised after a lifetime of contributions. And for younger generations, you seem to be paying now, but not having the same deal when you reach your own old age. I think the solution to this is to make age pension policy stable and predictable and honour the contributions that people are making now and those that they have made in the past. But really what I'm saying is that these examples are simply that. They're just examples. But what we can do with policy in the future is look at these different dimensions, ask questions of the policy initiatives and see where they fall in terms of these different interrogations that we can make. Now, it wouldn't be fair to go away without making some suggestions on how we might build alternatives. The pandemic will pass, but it may have implications for interconnection. But let's say what we can do with or without the implications of the pandemic is explore contributions that work towards combining specific life course priorities. How do we make different age groups come and share things, bring different things to the table, but combine them for positive solutions? Can we create an ideas bank for generating innovative environments and generationally intelligent action? Let's create a memory for things that work that we can draw on for the future. Let's recognize the shared precarity of generations and future selves as a foundation for intergenerational solidarity. Now, I've done a bit of work on this with Al and Harpala. We've looked at some examples from education, shared living, and commensality, which is eating together in non-familial settings. But I think there's obviously much more we can do in terms of researching how intergenerational relations can work and how we can inoculate people against these notions of rivalry. Finally, I would suggest that when we consider the life course and aging, we have to connect it to other major societal shifts, whether these be pandemic vulnerabilities, climate action, migration, or wealth inequality. Here are some references which you can follow up some of the points that are made, and I'm hoping that these can be made available to you with the handout of this PowerPoint during the conference. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this has given you some ideas that may be useful to you in critically assessing policy, specifically around age and intergenerational relations. Thank you very much.